The Montana sky stretched endlessly above Jack Harmon as he leaned against the weathered fence post of the Running Creek Ranch. At 53, the lines on his face told stories of decades under the sun, his skin tanned and roughened by years of honest work. Every evening for the past 20 years, as the golden hour bathed the rolling grasslands in amber light, Jack performed the same ritual. He removed his worn leather hat, closed his eyes, and spoke softly to the wind. "Just checking in," he would say, his voice barely audible even to himself. "The north pasture's doing fine. Moved the herd to fresh grass. Rain would be welcome, though." Sometimes he'd share more personal thoughts, concerns about the drought, or memories of his late wife, Sarah. It was a habit he had developed after her passing, a way to process his thoughts in the vastness of the land he loved. Nothing mystical about it, just a solitary man finding comfort in the quiet ritual of speaking his mind to the open air. "Looks like another dry week ahead," Jack murmured, replacing his hat and surveying the distant mountains. He didn't notice Miguel watching him from a stable doorway. Miguel Sanchez had worked as a ranch hand at Running Creek for 3 summers now. At 26, he respected the older cowboy's experience and had learned more from Jack than he'd ever learned in agricultural college. He'd often observed Jack's evening conversations, but had never mentioned them out of respect for the man's privacy. "Dinner's ready when you are, boss," Miguel called, pretending he'd just stepped outside. Jack nodded, his weathered face breaking into a slight smile. "Be right there." The ranch house was modest but comfortable, a 2-story structure built in the 1930s that Jack had painstakingly maintained over the years. The kitchen smelled of Miguel's excellent chili, a recipe from his grandmother that had become a staple at the ranch. "Weather service says no rain for at least 10 days, Miguel mentioned as they ate at the wooden table. Jack sighed. "3rd dry summer in a row. Might have to sell some of the herd if it continues." "The reservation's having water issues too," Miguel said. "My cousin works with the tribal council. Says the elders are getting worried." The Northern Cheyenne Reservation bordered Running Creek Ranch to the east. Jack had maintained good relations with the tribe over the years, respecting boundaries and occasionally helping with shared water resources. "They've been here a lot longer than us," Jack observed. "They understand this land better than anyone." After dinner, Jack sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the darkening landscape. His neighbor's ranch had been sold to a development company last year. The thought of subdivisions creeping closer to Running Creek kept him awake at night. The ranch had been in the Harmon family for 4 generations, but Jack had no children to pass it to. His brother's kids lived in Seattle and had no interest in ranching. The economic reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Land values soaring while cattle ranching profits dwindled. The next morning, Jack rose before dawn as usual. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as he saddled his horse, an 11-year-old quarter horse named Buck. The morning inspection of the property was another ritual, one rooted in practical necessity. As he rode along the eastern fence line, he noticed dust in the distance. Visitors were rare, especially this early. He watched as a pickup truck followed the dirt road toward the ranch house. By the time Jack returned, the truck was parked in front of the house. An older man stood talking with Miguel near the porch. Jack recognized him immediately, Thomas Eagle Feather, a respected elder from the Northern Cheyenne tribe. "Morning, Thomas," Jack called as he dismounted. "Everything all right?" Thomas turned, his face solemn but with a warmth in his eyes. "Jack, good to see you. I was hoping to talk with you about something important." Miguel excused himself to tend to the horses, leaving the 2 men alone. "Coffee," Jack offered, gesturing toward the house. Thomas nodded, following Jack inside. As they sat at the kitchen table with steaming mugs, Thomas seemed to be carefully considering his words. "Our council met yesterday," he finally said, "about the drought and other matters. Your name came up." Jack raised an eyebrow. "My name? What for?" Thomas looked directly at Jack, his expression unreadable. "There's some on the council who believe you might be connected to an old story passed down through generations. A story about a guardian who speaks to the winds." Jack stared at Thomas, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips. "A guardian who what now?" Thomas's weathered hands wrapped around his mug as he spoke. For generations, our people have passed down a story about a time of great change, when the land would face threats from those who don't understand it. The story speaks of someone who would come, a stranger to our people, but not to this land, who would speak to the winds and listen to what the earth needs. Jack set his mug down carefully. Thomas, I think there's been some misunderstanding. I'm just a rancher trying to keep this place going. People have seen you, Jack, for years, standing at the edge of your land at sunset, talking to the air. Thomas's voice held no judgment, just quiet certainty. Miguel's cousin mentioned it to his grandmother, who was one of our storytellers. Jack felt a flush of embarrassment. His private ritual wasn't meant for an audience. That's just, I talk things through sometimes. Out loud. It helps me think. Thomas nodded. I understand. But our stories don't speak of someone performing magic or having supernatural powers. They speak of someone who remembers how to listen, how to be in conversation with the land, someone who pays attention. Outside, the morning light strengthened, casting long shadows through the kitchen windows. Jack rose to refill their coffee cups, giving himself time to process this unexpected conversation. The council is divided, Thomas continued. Some believe the old stories are just that, stories. Others see connections to what's happening now. The drought, the development companies buying up ranches, the mining interests pushing at the edges of protected lands. Jack returned to the table. And what do you believe, Thomas? I believe that sometimes old wisdom finds new ways to be heard, Thomas replied. I'm not saying you're some chosen one or mystical figure, Jack. I'm saying that your way of being on this land, your connection to it, resonates with what our stories describe. Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. I'm flattered, I guess. But I'm just trying to run this ranch the way my father taught me, the way his father taught him. That's exactly my point, Thomas said. Those traditional ways of working with the land rather than against it are becoming rare. The council wants to talk with you about a partnership. Partnership? Jack asked, suddenly wary. He'd had his share of proposals over the years, from developers wanting to buy the land, from energy companies seeking mineral rights. The tribe has been granted federal funding for a water conservation project, Thomas explained. We need to work with neighboring landowners. Your ranch sits at a critical watershed point. Jack relaxed slightly. This was familiar territory, practical matters, rather than talk of guardians and old stories. The project involves restoring some of the natural water flow patterns, Thomas continued. It would require changes to how certain parts of your land are managed, but it could help with the drought conditions for everyone in the valley. Jack nodded slowly. I'd want to see the details, of course, but I'm open to it. There's a council meeting tomorrow evening. They've asked if you would come and speak with them. Thomas paused. Some of the elders specifically want to hear your thoughts on the changes you've seen in the land over the years. I'm not much for public speaking, Jack admitted. Just talk to them the way you talk to the wind, Thomas said with a slight smile. Later that afternoon, after Thomas had left, Jack found Miguel mending a fence in the west pasture. So, Jack said casually, you've been telling stories about me to your cousin? Miguel looked up, his expression momentarily alarmed before settling into sheepish acknowledgement. Not in a bad way, boss. I just mentioned once how you always take time to appreciate the land. My people have similar traditions. Jack nodded, not angry but thoughtful. Thomas invited me to speak to the tribal council tomorrow about some water conservation project. That's good, isn't it? Miguel asked. The reservation has been hit hard by the drought. Yes, it's good, Jack agreed. Just unexpected. That evening, Jack stood at his usual spot by the fence line. The ritual felt different now, knowing others had observed and interpreted it through their own cultural lens. He removed his hat as always, but hesitated to speak. Finally, he sighed. Well, this is awkward now. Apparently, I've been fulfilling some old story without even knowing it. He chuckled to himself. What would Sarah think of that? The wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage. Jack closed his eyes. I guess I'll hear them out tomorrow, he murmured. Maybe there's something to this partnership idea. Lord knows we could all use some help with this drought. The tribal council building sat on a gentle rise overlooking a valley of ponderosa pines. Jack parked his truck beside several others, feeling oddly formal in his clean jeans and pressed shirt. He'd even trimmed his beard for the occasion. Thomas was waiting at the entrance, dressed in a button-down shirt, with a BOLO tie featuring a silver and turquoise clasp. "Glad you came, Jack." "Said I would." Jack replied simply, following Thomas inside. The council room was larger than Jack had expected, with tall windows facing east and west. At the front, 7 people sat at a curved table, 4 men and 3 women, ranging in age from perhaps 30 to well over 80. About 24 community members occupied chairs arranged in a semicircle. Thomas led Jack to a chair position before the council table, then took his own seat among the council members. A woman at the center, perhaps in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a braid, spoke first. "Welcome, Mr. Harmon. I'm Eliza Running Bird, council chairwoman. We appreciate you joining us today." Jack nodded respectfully. "Thank you for inviting me." "Thomas has explained the water conservation project to you?" she asked. "The basics, yes. I'd like to hear more details." A younger man, introduced as Daniel Wolf, the tribe's environmental engineer, stood and walked to a large map mounted on an easel. For the next 20 minutes, he explained the project's technical aspects: watershed restoration, installation of permeable check dams to slow runoff, reintroduction of native grasses along creek beds, and monitoring systems to track water table levels. "Your ranch sits at a crucial point in the watershed," Daniel explained, pointing to Running Creek. "Water that flows through your land eventually reaches our main reservoir. The project would require allowing some portions of your northwest pasture to return to wetland conditions." Jack studied the map, asking practical questions about cattle access to water, maintenance responsibilities, and timeline. The council members seemed pleased with his engagement. "The federal grant covers all implementation costs," Daniel concluded, "and there are subsidies available for landowners who participate." "I'm not concerned about subsidies," Jack said. "I care about whether this will work. We're all facing the same drought." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Eliza spoke again. "Before we discuss formal agreements, some of the elders have questions they'd like to ask you." The oldest council member, a man whose face was a map of deeply etched lines, leaned forward slightly. "I am Joseph Eagle Feather, Thomas's father. I have lived in this valley for 87 years. My question is simple. What changes have you witnessed on your land in your lifetime?" Jack took a moment to gather his thoughts. The winters are warmer now. Snow doesn't last as long. Springs come earlier, but they're less predictable. Streams that used to flow year-round now run dry by August. He paused. "My father used to say you could set your watch by when certain wildflowers bloomed. That's not true anymore." Joseph nodded slowly. "And how do you decide when to move your cattle? When to plant, when to harvest?" "I watch the land," Jack said simply. "The plants tell you what they need if you pay attention. The animals, too. I keep records of course, rainfall, temperatures, grass conditions, but mostly I just observe." "And you speak to the wind," Joseph said. Not a question, but a statement. Jack felt heat rise in his face. "It's just a habit, a way of organizing my thoughts. Our people have always understood that relationship with the land is a conversation, not a monologue," Joseph said. "Modern science is only now beginning to understand what our ancestors knew, that everything is connected in a web of relationship." The discussion continued, moving between practical questions about the water project and deeper inquiries about Jack's approach to stewardship. He found himself speaking more openly than he had in years, describing how his grandfather had taught him to read weather patterns, how his father had emphasized the importance of leaving land better than you found it. As the meeting drew to a close, Eliza addressed Jack directly. "The council will prepare a formal proposal for your review. But based on today's discussion, it seems we share many of the same values regarding the land." Jack nodded. "I believe we do." Outside, as the summer evening cooled toward dusk, Thomas walked Jack to his truck. "That went well," Thomas observed. They're good people, Jack said, and it's a solid project. I don't see why we can't work together. Thomas seemed to hesitate before speaking again. There's something else I should mention. The story I told you about, the guardian who speaks to the wind. There's more to it. Jack leaned against his truck. More prophecies about me? He asked with a hint of dry humor. Not exactly, Thomas replied. The story speaks of the guardian facing a great challenge, a choice between preserving the old ways or embracing a new path forward. It says this choice will determine the future of the valley for generations to come. Jack sighed. Thomas, no disrespect to your traditions, but I'm just a rancher trying to adapt to changing times like everyone else. Perhaps, Thomas said, or perhaps that's exactly what the guardian would say. As Jack drove home in the gathering darkness, he couldn't help but think about Thomas's words. A choice between old ways and new paths. Wasn't that exactly what he'd been wrestling with these past few years? The discovery of the springs quickly transformed what had been a local development dispute into something far larger. Within days, environmental groups and water conservation advocates descended on the small Montana community, bringing media attention and heightened tensions. James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of newspapers and printed online articles. Most featured variations of the same headline. Ancient waters threaten billion-dollar resort development. Some included photos of him standing with Clara by the springs, making him uncomfortable with his unexpected public role. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Thomas stood on the porch, looking exhausted. Got a minute? He asked. James gestured him inside, pouring coffee for them both. How bad is it at the reservation? Thomas sighed, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. The council's deadlocked. Some members see the springs as a sign we should reject the development entirely. Others think we should use the discovery to negotiate better terms. And David. He shook his head. David's been suggesting that you and Grandmother orchestrated this whole thing to manipulate the tribe. That's ridiculous, James scoffed. Why would I do that? According to David, to drive up the value of your land. He's telling people that once the development falls through, you'll sell to another company for a premium. James set his mug down harder than intended. I have no intention of selling to anyone. I know that, Thomas said. But people are scared and confused. The reservation's unemployment rate is nearly 30%. Many see this resort as their children's only chance at a future here. The phone rang, interrupting them. James answered, his expression darkening as he listened. After a terse exchange, he hung up. St. Peak's lawyers, he explained. They're requesting access to my property for their own environmental assessment. Apparently, they filed for an expedited permit process with the State Water Authority. Thomas looked alarmed. Can they do that? My lawyer says they're within their rights to request it, but I can refuse for now. They'd need a court order to force access. James ran a hand through his graying hair. This is getting complicated fast. It's about to get more complicated, Thomas said. There's a tribal council meeting tonight. They're calling for a formal vote on the development proposal, springs or no springs. Grandmother asked if he would come. James hesitated. His involvement had already made him a controversial figure locally. Some neighbors had stopped speaking to him, believing he was deliberately sabotaging economic opportunity for the region. I'm not sure my presence would help at this point. Thomas leaned forward. My grandmother believes it will. And frankly, so do I. This isn't just about the development anymore. It's about the relationship between your ranch and our tribe. About healing old wounds. That evening, the community center was even more crowded than before. News cameras set up outside captured the arrival of environmental activists, development supporters, and community members. James parked several blocks away, hoping to enter quietly, but was spotted by a local reporter who shouted questions as he approached. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The tribal council sat at their table, faces grave. Clara was absent, which immediately concerned James. Where's your grandmother? He asked Thomas as they found seats. At home. She wasn't feeling well enough to come tonight. Thomas lowered his voice. The stress is taking a toll on her. Robert Black Eagle called the meeting to order. his voice firm despite the murmurs that continued throughout the room. "Before we proceed to a vote on the St. Pete proposal," he announced, "we have some new information to consider." He nodded to a woman James recognized as Lisa Bird, the environmental specialist who had tested the spring water. Lisa stepped to the podium, placing a laptop connected to a projector. "Initial tests confirmed that the springs on the Harrington property are part of the same aquifer system that runs beneath the proposed development site. More concerning, we found traces of naturally occurring arsenic in the water." The room erupted in confused conversation. Lisa raised her hand for quiet. "This level of arsenic isn't unusual for this region and isn't dangerous at current concentrations. However, the extensive excavation required for the resort's foundation and underground parking could disturb the sediment layers that currently keep the arsenic contained, potentially contaminating the entire watershed." David Tallfeather immediately stood. "These are preliminary findings from tests conducted without St. Pete's involvement. We should wait for their experts." "Their experts didn't find the springs in the first place," someone shouted from the crowd. The meeting quickly devolved into opposing factions, shouting over one another. Robert Black Eagle struggled to maintain order. James sat silently, watching the community fracture before his eyes. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Clara Running Wolf entered, moving slowly, but with purpose, supported by a younger woman James didn't recognize. The room gradually quieted as she made her way to the front. "Grandmother," Thomas whispered, alarmed. "You should be resting." Clara ignored him, approaching the council table. "I have spent my life working to preserve our people's connection to this land," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Tonight, I fear we are forgetting what truly matters." She turned to face the crowd. "This is not about money or jobs or one development. This is about our responsibility as caretakers of the land that sustains us all." Her eyes found James in the crowd, and she gestured for him to join her. After a moment's hesitation, he did. "Mr. Harrington and his family have lived alongside us for generations," Clara continued. "We have not always been friends, but the land has chosen to reveal its secrets now, through both of us, for a reason." Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if punctuating her words. Through the windows, James could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The storm that had threatened during the council meeting broke in the early hours of the morning, bringing the heaviest rainfall the region had seen in decades. James stood on his porch, watching water cascade down the gutters and pool in the yard. His phone had been ringing constantly, neighbors reporting flooded pastures, washed-out access roads, and stranded livestock. By noon, it became clear this was no ordinary storm. The creek that ran through his property, the one fed by the newly discovered springs, had swollen dramatically, threatening to overflow its banks. More concerning were the reports coming from the reservation, where several families had been evacuated from homes in low-lying areas. James loaded his truck with sandbags, shovels, and rope, then headed toward the reservation. The main road was partially flooded, forcing him to take a longer route around. When he finally arrived at the community center, he found it transformed into an emergency shelter. Families with young children and elders sat on cots, while volunteers distributed coffee and sandwiches. Thomas spotted him immediately. "James, didn't expect to see you here. Heard you could use some extra hands and supplies," James replied, gesturing to his truck. "How bad is it?" 6 homes flooded so far. The cultural center's basement is underwater. We're trying to salvage the archives." Thomas ran a hand over his face. "Grandmother's house is on higher ground, but we moved her here to be safe." James followed Thomas's gaze to where Clara sat speaking quietly with a group of children, apparently telling them a story to keep their minds off the crisis. "What about the development site?" James asked. Thomas's expression darkened. "Completely flooded. Their preliminary excavation work created a channel straight into their main construction area. The St. Pete people are in a panic. Their equipment is submerged." As they unloaded supplies, Robert Black Eagle approached, extending his hand to James. "Harrington, thank you for coming." James shook his hand, noting the change in the council chairman's demeanor. "Least I could do We're all facing the same storm. Black Eagle nodded. Some might say the land itself has rendered a verdict on the development. He gestured toward a corner, where David Tall Feather stood in intense conversation with the St. Peak representative, both looking grim. Throughout the day, James worked alongside reservation residents, securing buildings, digging drainage channels, and helping move possessions to higher ground. By late afternoon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, though the creek continued to rise as water from higher elevations made its way down. As evening approached, James found himself helping in the kitchen of the community center, serving hot food to tired volunteers. Clara appeared beside him, deftly filling bowls with stew despite her age. "Your timing is interesting, Mr. Harrington," she said quietly. "Just trying to help where I can," he replied. "I meant your discovery of the springs, just when our community faced its greatest division." She handed a bowl to a young mother with a toddler on her hip. "Some might call it coincidence." James continued ladling stew. "What would you call it?" Clara smiled slightly. "I would call it the land speaking through someone who has been listening." Before James could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. David Tall Feather had entered, soaking wet and looking defeated. He spoke briefly with Robert Black Eagle, then, surprisingly, made his way toward Clara and James. "The development site is a disaster," he said without preamble. "St. Peak's pulling out. Their engineers say the flooding revealed major issues with the ground stability that make the project too risky." Clara regarded her grandnephew steadily. "And how do you feel about this, David?" He sighed heavily. "I still think we need economic development, but maybe not this project, not in that location." He glanced at James. "Your springs might have saved us from a bigger disaster down the road." In the days that followed, as floodwaters receded and the community began recovery efforts, something unexpected emerged. The crisis had brought the tribal members and local ranchers together in ways decades of uneasy coexistence had not. Work crews moved between properties, helping wherever they were needed without regard for the invisible boundaries that had long divided them. 2 weeks after the storm, James received a formal invitation to attend a special council meeting. When he arrived, he was surprised to find not only tribal members, but many of his fellow ranchers present as well. Robert Black Eagle opened the proceedings with an announcement. The council had unanimously voted to permanently protect the watershed that included both the newly discovered springs and the sacred water sources on tribal land. They were proposing a collaborative management plan that would involve both the tribe and local landowners. "We've lived as neighbors, but not as partners for too long," Black Eagle said. "This land has always connected us, even when we pretended otherwise." After the meeting, Clara found James outside, gazing at the sunset. The storm had cleared the air, making the colors especially vivid against the western mountains. "Will you continue your morning conversations with the wind, Mr. Harrington?" she asked. James smiled. "Some habits are hard to break." "Good," Clara nodded. "The wind still has much to tell you, I think." Together, they watched as the last light faded from the sky. On the horizon, the silhouettes of people, tribal members and ranchers alike, moved across the landscape, working together to rebuild what the storm had damaged. James thought about the title the media had given him in their stories about the springs and the failed development, "The Cowboy Who Whispered to the Wind." It wasn't accurate, of course. He hadn't done anything special, just followed a personal ritual of grief and connection that had somehow, through coincidence or something more profound, aligned with the community's moment of need. "My wife would have liked you," he said suddenly to Clara. "She always said people should listen more to the land." Clara smiled. "Perhaps she still speaks to you, through the wind." James didn't respond, but as they stood in comfortable silence, the evening breeze picked up, carrying the mingled scents of sage, pine, and damp earth, the breath of a land beginning to heal.